Okay, thank you for being with us this afternoon. And I want to begin by introducing myself and the panelists as folks continue to trickle in. Thank you for being in attendance, and please feel free to use the Q&A function for questions that may arise during the panel, and we'll save some time for that at the end. So hello, thank you so much for serving as panelists for Visceral Change's inaugural Women's Leadership Panel. We are honored to have such successful women with us today who are willing to share their stories about struggles and success as women in the contemporary American workplace. For those of you who are attending, who are joining us today, who are new to Visceral Change, we are an organizational development consultancy that works with institutions and organizations across the globe to help center their professional work frameworks around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our mission: to move equity and inclusion from an individual resource to an organizational value, means that we believe that your organizational health, success, and longevity has everything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that you cannot truly maximize the potential of your organization without first tapping into the strengths of your diversity. Please visit our website, visceralchange.org, for more information. Today's format is as follows. I will begin with the introductions of the panelists, and then I will ask the general questions for all the panelists to answer. From there, each panelist will be asked 2 unique questions specific to their work and journeys. We will close the moderated section with a final general question before opening it up to the audience for Q&A. The panelists have received their questions ahead of time and will have 6 minutes to respond to each question. So let's meet the panelists. We have Dr. Smadar Naoz, Associate Professor, Department of Physics and Astronomy at UCLA. Welcome, Smadar. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
We have Cindu Thomas-George, Tenured Professor of Communication Studies at the College of Lake County in Illinois, and founder and principal trainer of Shakti Diversity and Equity Training. Thank you, Cindu.
Thanks for having me.
And down in the corner, we also have Dr. Liza Hita, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of Online Programming and Digital Immersion for the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University.
Really glad to be here this afternoon.
Thanks, Dr. Hita. And we also have Melia Dunn, Equity and Inclusion Trainer and Facilitator, founder of Melia Dunn Consulting, based out of Phoenix, Arizona. Great to have you, Melia.
Yeah, I'm happy to be included.
And I'm your moderator, Dr. Stephanie Troutman Robbins. I am the Department Head of Gender and Women's Studies and Associate Professor of Emerging Literacies and Rhetoric and Composition at the University of Arizona. All right, so we're going to jump right into the questions. I'm very excited. And this will be a question that's posed for everyone, and we'll just go around and folks can answer. And we'll jump in and just kind of organically flow from whoever goes first to, if there's a connection, then the next person can just jump in. So for starters, let's have you tell us a little bit more about what you do and why you decided to enter the field that you're in. And what, in your opinion, are some of the major issues facing women in your career field or your profession now? And we'll think about also any challenges or adversities you've faced in the field and how you've dealt with it or learned to overcome it. So kind of a catch-all, but we'll hear more about folks' journeys and experiences. Cindu, can we start with you?
Sure, sorry. You asked a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to remember all of them. A little bit about what I do. I have dual careers. So I'm a tenured professor at a community college about 45 minutes outside of Chicago, and I am in the Department of Communication Studies. I specialize in intercultural communication and public speaking. I'm also the founder and I would say, lead principal trainer for Shakti Diversity and Equity Training. And it's a boutique consulting firm. And I work across industries to help cultivate inclusion and equity, anti-racism, and intercultural competency within organizations. So how I got into the field, or why I kind of fell into this field, was really based on my personal experiences. I grew up in a white homogenous community outside of Chicago in the 80s, and we were the only family of color and one of the only immigrant families. And the other immigrant families were Polish and from Eastern Europe. So I experienced a lot of unfortunate racism and xenophobia from an early age of 5. And so I've kind of always experienced kind of being the only, being the other. And then when I entered higher education in my early 20s, when I first started teaching in San Francisco, I experienced a lot of ageism because I was in my early to mid 20s. Sexism and racism all kind of at the same time. And I think that I experienced a lot of othering, and that kind of really drew me to kind of do the work so that other people don't have to experience some of the experiences that I had. And you said, what are some of the challenges for a woman? I think that and I know many of us are in higher education. Higher education is predominantly a white male industry. Just off the cuff, like 80% of educators are white in this country. And so you have a lot of racial bias, you have gender bias, you have age bias. And one of my personal struggles was overcoming some of this imposter syndrome that was created by other people, right? When I first started teaching, I was at City College of San Francisco, and I got an office that I had to share with another adjunct, and he had probably been there for 25 years. He was probably 60 at least. And he would refuse to share the desk with me. And so I would come in really excited to start my career, and I would bring my books and my picture frames. And the next day I would come in and it would all be on the floor of my office. And then I would be receiving racist notes from him. He would be talking about me like, I don't know how they hired her to teach communication. She doesn't even speak English right or well. And, English is my second language. My parents did not speak English at home. So I probably said a word, mispronounced something, and he picked up on that. And, and so that was my first entrance. That was my first semester in higher education as a full-time adjunct. And so I think some of those, I have so many more that I'm not going to sit here and talk about, but those experiences, those oppressive experiences really taught me that I have to not be afraid to use my voice. And the racism and whatever you call it got so bad that other faculty members were overhearing this person and said, you need to do something. And my dean got involved and he didn't care. And so after a few months, the union had to get involved. So I had to sit down and have a mediated conflict with this man who was crying because he had to share space with me. And the only way that I got my space was because he was contractually obliged to sign something that said he'll stop being a bully to me. So I think my experience is probably a little bit more drastic, but I think it's not, I'm not alone, so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, I do think that unfortunately, many of us have experienced something similar. And when it's occurring at the intersections, of race and gender and class and immigration and language, right? It's a lot. It can be really overwhelming. Thank you, though, for sharing and for persisting and continuing as a professional in the field. Yeah. Liza, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Also, thank you for sharing that story. I think of these unconventional paths to where we're at. So I think I'll start with where I'm at and then how I got there. So, per my introduction, I work at ASU, and I'm primarily an administrator there and a community-based participatory researcher by training. So I study, interventions for high conflict families, prison impacted families, and primarily bereaved families. So creating parenting interventions for families experiencing major life transitions. And so, I love that work. A lot of that's grant chasing and, those kind of less glorious parts of the job, but I appreciate the people I get to help each day. I'm a clinician by training, and I worked in community health in various communities for many years before I became an academician, and I continue to do clinical supervision with folks all over the country that run these parenting groups and work in the parenting sector. And I share that because I never really wanted to be a psychologist. I moved from California because I was a young mother and a young partner, newly married. And I was a labor organizer in California, and I came to Arizona and there weren't jobs here. And as I mentioned, I was a young mom with kids, and, you know, I needed to find a hustle, right? Like I needed to feed my family. So I always share this that, you know, I grew up in a middle-class family. So I didn't grow up in what I would consider to be poverty. But poverty came to me as an adult, you know, and it wasn't because I didn't make enough money. It was because the choices that I made didn't pay me a lot, you know, which were really my true passions. I was a community organizer, and I worked for these labor unions. And then when I came to Arizona, like that work wasn't there. So I quickly had to make some decisions about, well, what am I good at? What do I do? And I was like, well, when I was organizing in the labor unions, I was sitting in people's homes asking them, you know, how can I be of service to you? Like, what do you need? You know? And so I was like, I don't know. I saw an ad in the paper. That's how long ago it was. It was in the late 90s, like there was paper stuff. And I became a therapist. Somebody was like, you'd probably be a great therapist. And in Arizona, you could do that back then. It wasn't a licensure state. So because of that, I mean, that's actually how I went into academia, is that I needed to feed my family. And when I got my master's degree because like Arizona was transitioning into a licensure state. So I was kind of already in a job that I didn't feel passionate about, but I was like good at it, and it fed my family kind of. And then I went in and I got a PhD because I had this intersection of like personal and professional, like I was like having a crisis at the time. And I was a single mom. I had these 2 young kids. I'm like, I need to feed my family and I need flexibility and I can't work 9 to 5. I got babies, you know? And so, you know, I share this story because I made what I consider to be value-based decisions, right? Relationship-based decisions. And there's an inherent gendered component to that because I was the mom with the kids. And so sometimes when I say, well, I made these decisions because of my family, people assume there's a gendered component, you know, because I'm the mom, you know? But no, I made them to survive. You know, I made them because I'm a survivor and I come from a long lineage of, you know, I come from an immigrant family. So I'm first generation born here and they are survivors. And so I learned all of these implicit and explicit strategies from just growing up in my home. Too many to even like label or count. So I knew that I needed to survive and I could survive, you know, so that's how and actually, I only wanted to go to ASU because it was local, like U of A, that was too far, you know? I didn't even know ASU was a good program because I didn't have like the intergenerational kind of cultural and intellectual capital to be like, oh, PhD programs are A, B, and C. I'm like, I don't know, it's there. And if I don't, I'm just gonna get an MFA in creative writing. Like I'm just gonna do something because I need to do something more and I needed to defer my loans, you know? So another survival tactic, right? But underneath it all, like my faith and my love for my family, as well as the things that I was taught growing up about what you do to survive, and that there are good and helpful people everywhere, ended up being a great decision for me. So it's like the career that I have now, I didn't start out with like this passion and all of these things that we're kind of socialized to think we should have when we go into a career. I felt like I did it for the right reasons for me. And then like all those doors opened because I was rooted in my values. You know, I was rooted in what I consider to be my boundaries, you know, what I consider to be my core value system within myself. Because you have to. I didn't know that as a young person I was doing that, but when I mentor students and young mothers in my community, I'm like, trust yourself, because you know there's things out there you don't know about, but they're waiting for you to fulfill. So that's how I got to be a psychologist and an academician, and it was hard, but I'm glad that I'm here now because it fit all of those values that were so important to me back then. They're still important to me now.
Thanks so much, Liza, for the really candid and honest answers. I really appreciate that. And it resonates a lot with me in my own journey. I tell people all the time that I'm an academic. It was not an intended pathway for me. As a person who I loved learning, I was good at school, I was interested in education, and sort of it evolved, right? As we're making those choices for ourselves and what we're good at. And you know, I was also first generation, and a lot of those kinds of similarities there, a lot of synergy. Thanks so much Let's hear from Smadar and then Melia.
Sure. I'm a professor at UCLA. I'm a theoretical astrophysicist, which means that I study what's happening in the universe around us. I hope some of you have heard about exoplanets. We've been discovering quite a bit, but they don't look anything like our own solar system. So part of my work is to try to understand why. Or maybe you heard about black holes that are merging together and sending gravitational waves and doing all kind of interesting things. So it's also part of my work to understand why, and it's a lot of fun. And I knew I wanted to be a theoretical. Well, I knew I wanted to be an astrophysicist, not necessarily theoretical astrophysicist, since I was 5 years old. Thanks to watching Star Trek, the original series, with my mother. I am from Israel originally, and we had this black and white TV, and I didn't know English, so she used to read the subtitles for me, and it's one of my really sweetest early memories. But I didn't have a lot of support. I was not allowed to study physics in school because I was told that I'm too stupid, for example. And it was not so easy to continue to study. I did it anyways. So from my family, I'm the first person to go to college and only person with a PhD. And it wasn't considered to be very like the smart move to go and learn physics out of all the things that I wanted to learn. But I think I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. So that really drove me forward. You asked also what's the biggest issue I think that women in my field are facing. So physics and astronomy is predominantly men, specifically white men. And I would say it's a type of a field that I hope that slowly is changing as time goes by, and I'm definitely working very hard to try to change it. But there is some notion that you're supposed to be born to be a physicist, which I completely disagree with, because it makes it really hard for people to enter the field, and people who are not looking like the majority. So that is, I think, one of the major problems, the notion that you need this secret gene. And I think that that is really a big challenge for a lot of people, and to really enter the field. And the biggest challenge that I faced so in astronomy, specifically, there are about between 20 to 25, sometimes even 30, depending on which levels, 30%, so between 20% to 30% of women. But in theoretical astrophysics, it's about 10%. So 10% are women. And one of the things that is different than observational astrophysics, where you observe the supernova, so no one can argue with you that this is there. In theory, you come up with some set of equations and an idea how to understand a puzzle, and then you need to show it that it's correct. And this is what usually people do. But I found that people doubt me more than my male colleagues. In fact, if it happened a couple of times when I worked on something, and then similar timescale, a male colleague worked on it, and somehow his work considered to be more accurate, even though it's the same equation, everything, but it's just like the usual approaches. Why you? Like, how can you come up with this? Or maybe you are not good to do that. So there's a lot of bias, I think, that doubts women more in this field. So one of my challenges is that I did something, I would say maybe big, and it was challenged by the community, I think, more than I expected. And until this day, I get, even though it's now established there, I just came from a conference about this. So it's about the three-body problem. It's something that is very well established now. For 10 years, we've been working on this. But still now I'll get an email said, are you sure you don't have mistakes in your original paper? That it's something that I asked a very unofficial survey my male colleagues. They don't get that. So it's interesting. So that's my, and the way that I do, and the way that I overcome it is I just continue. So I'll just continue to prove that this is correct, and that will be fine.
Thanks so much, Smadar, for sharing also about sort of your personal entry point as a little girl watching, Star Trek. We, these other kind of influences, right, that again are maybe non-traditional and sparking our interest or bringing us into this path. I think it's also important to recognize that and talk about it, because I do think so often young people are maybe not influenced in, or don't know about some of these jobs, except for, through popular culture or other kinds of representations, right? And then that can be the beginning of something. So that's really cool. Thank you so much. Melia?
All right. Well, I do not live in the world of academia and have so much respect for all of you who do. And it's an intimidation piece, right? Around that. But I work as a DEI practitioner, similar, working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm really liking the language right now to bring in another historic space experience of Jedi. I'm hearing folks saying Jedi, so it's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think I like that because it's part of the long game. And, I'm a white woman who wants to work with the white people who need to get our shit figured out, right? But I came to this work after being in nonprofit work for several years and writing grants and asking for money and securing the finances for other people to go do really important, meaningful, transformative work. And that's an important step and it's an important element of it, but I wasn't happy doing it. And I felt too far removed from impact and too far removed from the connection with humans. And at that time, I was approaching one of the milestone birthdays and started to think about if 10-year-old me, who definitely recognized when things were unfair and that was not okay, and I'm gonna be, come and hang out with the student who is being left out, the little girl me is this what she saw my future being, and the answer was very clearly no. And that sent me then on a track of doing some really transformative mid-career pivots and exploring some international work and recognizing, I think in that recognizing how the United States likes to think we're so far advanced and we're just so fantastic, and you leave and say oh, we don't have it figured out either, and the differences are not as great as we might believe. And I think in that really brought me back to the States of wanting to work in bridging and understanding and helping folks work against the inequities that exist and that are surrounding us at all times. Currently, if I think about major issues that are facing this work, and I'd be curious, Cindu, if you agree as well, of just the pace and the sustainability of working with clients with what some have kind of called the current woke wave, and the sense of urgency, right? I haven't been working at this at all, but now it's urgent and we need the work to happen right now. And we don't want to be talking about it. We want to do things and have results. And it's like, I'm thrilled by the desire for results. And there's a lot of unlearning to do before we get into the actions. And it's not just tell me what to do and I'll do it. So I think navigating that, could lean on a psychologist for here, like navigating, holding that space for folks and being able to kind of talk through the long game and talk through what this is going to take. And then managing those expectations, I think can be really difficult. And right with an unmanageable pace, burnout and apathy is tough. And then finding the inspiration, right? To like pause and be like, no, let's find the inspiration. I was on a call with a couple female colleagues who we collaborate, and one of them yesterday said, I've been working so much and I'm realizing that I'm not feeling inspired and I need to pause and rest and know that that is also part of the work of resistance and change. So with that, I think that urgent, like managing that is one of the adversities of being in the work. Managing my own whiteness and unlearning my whiteness is certainly an adversity that I anticipate I'll be facing for the rest of my life. And I think getting into really truth telling. I was really raised and socialized in a way to be a peacekeeper, and what I see now is that actually like keeping the peace was preserving systems of oppression. And so to kind of resist that desire to keep peace and be liked, and replace that with actually being a truth teller and being useful. And it's hard, but it's actually something that when it happens, it feels really good. And I think it's, it took me 40 some years to get into a place where I realized, oh, that good feeling is actually living authentic truth and not modifying or bending to meet someone else's expectations of what they want and what would keep them happy.
Thank you so much for that, Melia. And again, for talking to us about your awakening moment, your epiphany and your career change, and really like living to those authentic values that, Liza was saying also, energized and inspired, her journey. It's about, what are these values, and then seeing what's possible and what doors open and where things kind of, start to align when you really feel like you're moving toward that purpose. So I really appreciate that. Thanks, Melia. And so often, and some of the things you point out too at the end are really important for us, I think, all to think about as a panel, is the sort of like, as women, oftentimes we're assumed to have certain values, or we're pushed in the direction of embracing or adopting particular kinds of values, right? And so often, and some of those things are not necessarily bad, right? But how authentic are they? And then how, and when do we get that opportunity to kind of evaluate critically, like what that means for us and what kind of choices we have as a result. And then, also too, like thinking about disruption and the power of disruption and anger and some of the things that we're kind of told to back away from, but that are full of, energy and information, as Audre Lorde would say. And so thinking about that as we kind of move through our next round of questions. So we're going to move into the part of the panel where there are specific questions directed toward our panelists. Now that those who are in the audience more about our journeys and who we are here, the next questions will be a little more specific to tailored to the person. So we'll begin with you, Smadar. And you talked about a little bit already, how women show up in astrophysics in your field. And I would think, how, I guess, So in terms of your own journey, which is ongoing, as you say, there's certain things persist around your contributions to the field and the work that you're doing, right? And so how does that impact, or how do you feel you're able to, mentor other, women or marginalized folks in astrophysics? Because one of the things for myself that I find is like, since I'm still dealing with the racism and the sexism and things like that, and it's very fatiguing, sometimes it can be hard to mentor others, knowing that they're going to have to also continue to like deal with these injustices and be expected to also mentor others, right? Like, because that's kind of how it works. So maybe talk to us a little bit about how you see yourself as a mentor in this space, given the context.
That's a very good question, and I think that the path that I took equipped me to help a lot, specifically because so I think that if I understand the rules of the game, maybe I can be in the game and then change the rules of the game, and that is the setting that I've decided to do. So, for example, when I give talks in conferences or when I teach, what I do is I dress up and I wear a jacket and I have my hair up. And I actually took data to see what are the reactions of people when my hair is down versus when my hair is up. And it's interesting to say that, or maybe sad to say, that when my hair is down, people take me less seriously. I also make sure when I talk, I've noticed how men give talks and how women talk. And I think that when we talk with, our hands movement are a little bit more fluid. Men are very, they have straight hand movement. I don't know, it's like vectors. they point to stuff. So I really practiced a lot that when I'll give a talk representing my science, communication is a big deal in our field. So when I communicate, I'll communicate it with the straight head movement. It will be very clear that I'm part of the scientific community. So because I think that they expect something when they see me, and I try to minimize what will make them think about something else versus my science. And then because I can be in a place of power, I'll make sure that a woman giving a talk and not hiding her femininity, that will be no consequences. So it helps me be it helped me gaining that confidence and be in this place. But having this understanding of how the game is played helps me to share from my path, and also then to really help my mentees. And I think facing adversity in general is something that I think that there is some part when you face adversity that you can try to overlap with someone else who may not have the same path as you. So I may not have the same path as one of my mentees or other mentees that grew up here and had the same had different experiences as a kid than me. But then I can maybe try first to educate myself, understand, and also, things are changing. I was in a university with no women faculty, and there are women faculty. I mean, still a small amount, but we are there and we're growing. So I think that there is some change, slow, but it is, and it's. I know I'm pretty much optimistic about the future. And I do think that being a mentor from a place of I can try to learn and I can try to understand, and I had some parts of my path that was challenging, and maybe I can draw from there to try to understand what someone from maybe different intersectionality that has. I can just try to understand. I don't have to experience everything, I think. I don't know if I answered the question correctly, or this is something that I don't know. I know there's no right and wrong here, but I'm trying to understand if I understood your question correctly and if I answered it.
No, I absolutely. I think it's talking about like, right, how you're modeling like the presentation style and minimizing certain things, right? Modeling that for your students, and then also using your personal journey to make connections, even if there are differences, because as you point out, just because there are different types of adversities faced, it doesn't necessarily mean that some of the feelings or skills or experiences that came out of your particular scenario, you know, those things connect or can be points of connection with someone else who is also experiencing some kind of difficulty, even if it's not identical, I think, to yours. So thank you so much for.
Can I follow up with one little thing here? So
Yes.
I think that many times women are being put under a label. You're good in math, you're bad in math, you cannot do physics, or stuff like that I heard constantly. And I think one of the hardest things, but maybe the most important thing, is not listening to those labels and knowing to find where you can get the support. As a mentor, I can help. And you know, I've been put into a label so many times. So I think this is something that in our lives, we're constantly being said, you know, this is what you're good at. But I am a strong believer that if you're passionate about something, you'll just learn and get the skill. Everything is possible. It's maybe a little bit harder, but it is possible. So anyway, that's my key thing, I guess. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Smadar, for sharing that. And the hopeful and positive, you know, attitude of like, it might be harder, but it's not impossible. And I think that is something that, you know, as women of color and other marginalized folks really need to hold on to that. Cindu, we'll move back to you. So you did an interview last year on the role of allyship for non-Black people of color. And as a champion of this particular work, I think maybe talk to us about what this means to you and how gender impacts how you feel that you are maybe like received, you know, in the field of DEI or gender.
Yeah. So I've been doing anti-racism work from, you know, just teaching, even though it wasn't necessarily part of intercultural communication. I always brought a critical race framework to the work that I do, just because I had such a personal experience and have with racism and, you know, marginalization due to race and ethnicity. But specifically, I started speaking out against about anti-Blackness within communities of color. Specifically, I'm Indian, so within my own community, because I grew up seeing it, right? And we oftentimes don't talk about racism as brown folks, because racism exists in this country in a very black and white binary, right? And so it's almost as if people were kind of like, well, I can't be racist, I'm Indian, or I'm brown, or we experienced racism. But I was seeing it so intimately happening, and then I was seeing it in the larger context outside of my family. And so, you know, I began really being vocal about that, bringing that into training in classrooms and just talking about anti-Blackness in general, because I think it is the biggest social problem that we have in this country. And I think that it's so important to me because I have been a direct beneficiary of the centuries of struggle for racial equality led by Black Americans. My parents immigrated here in the early 70s, right after the Civil Rights Act, and they wouldn't have come to a America that welcomed them. They wouldn't have had the success, the prosperity. They wouldn't have had any of that, and I wouldn't have had the privileges I have. So I really see it as a not just professional, but a personal commitment to speak out about anti-Blackness. And so I think that it's so important to realize that anti-Blackness is a product of white supremacy, right? And they need each other to exist. And so we need everyone to dismantle the system of whiteness. And that's kind of one of my goals in, you know, talking about this topic, not just to students, but in the anti-racism work that I now do in corporations. I will say before George Floyd was murdered, people were begging me not to talk about race, right? And then just within 3 weeks time, it was the opposite. And so I think it's important for everyone to realize that anti-Blackness is not a white person's problem. It's an everybody's problem, because we have been socialized subconsciously to be anti-Black. And I really am very grateful to Black Americans for paving the path for my freedom, for my success and my prosperity. So I think your other question was, how does gender kind of play into that? I would say not just gender, but also being Asian, right? I think I mentioned that racism tends to be very Black and white. And so Asian people are oftentimes, I would say, erased from the conversations on racism. And right now we're seeing a resurgence of anti-Asian hate. There's 17 countries that encompass Asian Americans, and I'm one of them, right? But we're not a monolith, and racism is experienced differently by different communities of color. But one thing that we all have in common is that communities of color experience racism, and white supremacy is really at the heart of that. And so I'm really, I think it's really important for everyone to do this work. And I get pushback for sure. You know, I've been doing anti-racism work at my college. I was one of the first people to really start that work. And I got grief from white folks and also from Black folks, right? And also in the work that I've been doing in the last year since George Floyd was murdered, I sit on a board for affinity group, Malayalis. So we're from Kerala, India, and I'm part of a group called Malayalis for Black Lives Matter. And I've gotten grief from people within my own community because there's a lot of just infighting, right? You know, Zora Neale Hurston famously said, when, you know, not all my skin folks are my kin folks. And I've experienced that so much. I think there's a lot of people of color that are coming after each other right now. I think there's people from the same racial groups that are coming at each other, and I have no idea why. But all I know is that when we're not on the same team and we're not in solidarity with each other, we're just letting white supremacy thrive. So I definitely have experienced resistance. And I think a lot of it is because I'm South Asian, and people just assume that because you know, the model minority myth is hurting us, but it also has this idea that, you know, because I'm Indian and we have the highest income and we have the highest educational attainment, then what do you know about oppression, or what do you know about any of this? I've literally had people say, what the hell are you doing talking about anti-Black racism? You're not Black, right? But I think that in a multiracial society, everybody has a place in the conversation and the actions towards anti-racism, including white folks, right? So I don't know if did I answer all the questions, or do you have anything else to add?
No, I really appreciate that, Cindu, and I think it's really important, right? When we think about how white supremacy functions, and when we think about it in relation to even patriarchy, right? And how, you know, everyone on this panel, and also myself as the moderator, you know, we're subjects in this patriarchal and white project in our society. And so thinking about that architecture and how that, you know, those things kind of critically reinforce each other, and what that means for our experiences and the work that we do, I think is important to try to, you know, connect those dots and understand that, and make that really clear for those who are attending and just in our conversation amongst ourselves. So thank you for.
And I just wanted to add one thing, just because, you know, I'm a woman in higher ed and we have several on this panel. You know, I see a lot, the people who are hurting the most in my, you know, world, at least, are Black women, right? Because of anti-Blackness, because of sexism. And so Black women are the ones that are having this trauma, you know, and so I think that, you know, we need to be pro-Black, not just fighting anti-Blackness. We need to take it a step further, and not just within our own communities, but within our institutions, right? So just wanted to add that.
Yes, and I really appreciate that, Cindu, both, you know, personally as a woman in that who falls into that space, and just also though as, you know, someone who's interested in doing this work and helping others, right, and in the space of the academy. So thank you and so much. Liza, we'll come back around to you, and this kind of piggybacks nicely off of some of the things that Cindu was just raising about the Asian American and Pacific Islander, you know, community. And so this question is, Asian American and Pacific Islander identified individuals have for decades been socially recognized as a racial and ethnic group who are free from systemic oppression, though subject to stereotypes, right? I think there's the myth of the model minority and other kinds of stereotypes that are not that have been in circulation for a really long time although people don't necessarily associate certain groups within with the systemic oppression. So in what ways have these social attitudes, I think, and stereotypes maybe impacted your own journey? And how have you seen these disparities continue to affect the AAPI community?
So I'm going to take a brief pause, just because this is a simple but really loaded question, you know? So some of the things that you said, Cindu, really are at the heart of, you know, what I want to share. And so I don't need to say some of the things that you did because you eloquently talked about some of these stereotypes about Asian people in general, in a hierarchical way, if people are going to kind of frame minorities and quantify their oppression and see it from an outside gaze. So thank you for framing that. And the reason why I think that, you know, of course, like my story is always kind of framing the kind of professional aspects of what I talk about. And, you know, I understand from an outside gaze, people may be like, why would you know about, you know, Asian American and Pacific Islander communities? Because people don't see me, like they physically don't see me. They don't see how I embody that, you know? And so I also come from, you know, a multicultural, multi-ethnic lens, and speaking for those, like the duplicity of those identities and the, how that's complicated, particularly in American society where these things are thought of as myopic and box checking, you know, and how that impacts Asian communities and Pacific Islander communities. You know, so my story is that my mom, and this is layered, right? So I think a lot of folks come into circles and they can share their identity readily. It's easily identifiable. It's easy to share. And so I kind of have like a general folks answer. And then I have like a people who I know better answer. And then I have like a my people answer, you know, like who deserves to hear my sacred story? You know, who deserves to know all the different layers of me? And so, you know, on the surface, like my general, you know, take on this is, okay, my mom's Filipino, my dad's Ukrainian. That's often like meets the threshold of curiosity that people have. Oh, okay, you know, so they can relax, right? You know, or they can understand why maybe I don't speak the language that they think I should speak, you know, or that, you know, they can place me. And that's really important for an outside gaze, right? Is placing people. And so, you know, within the AAPI community, there's all of these different layers, right? Like you mentioned, Cindu, this is a vast continent. And, you know, so my experience, you know, I'll talk about, you know, my mom's people is that, you know, there's some Filipino folks out there listening to this, you know, we're pretty regional. We take that stuff real serious. And so we're Visayan, my family's Visayan, and then we're from the island of Panay, and we're from the province of Aklan. Like we're Aklanon, we're people of the water. So we have a really strong indigenous identity there that's particularly important on our island, because there's an indigenous confederacy that, you know, started in our island and spread throughout Southeast, the southern part of the Philippines. And some of those folks came from Borneo, and some of them came from the island. They're indigenous Ate people that phenotypically look much more like First Nations people from Australian Aborigines, right? So I talk in, you know, in various circles about my hair. I have, this is all professionally straightened, you know, all of these things that are another part of like not being seen within Asian and Pacific Islander culture, right? So I always use the kind of the analogy that people from my mom's island, we're always looking east. We consider like those are relatives, people from Micronesia, people from Polynesia, people from Samoa, from Guam, from the Philippine Islands, I mean, from the Hawaiian Islands, and from New Zealand, right? Like that's who we have more kind of a cultural symmetry with. So I share all of that because people don't realize how nuanced this group of people are when they say Asian, you know, or they say Pacific Islander. And they've kind of grouped all of our experiences up together when a lot of Filipinos, our identity and our experiences are highly calibrated by Spanish and American intrusion and colonization, right? And so there's all of these kind of historical factors that make us very distinct, you know? So I'm not getting into, again, quantifying, you know, who had it worse here and who can identify with this culture there, but I'm kind of just stating the historical facts, you know? And so I think part of that misunderstanding of historical context and then this like overly general grouping has had a lot of negative impacts on how the outside gaze, you know, the larger kind of cultural hegemonic frame of Asians has impacted me as an individual and impacts Asian and Pacific Islander women in general. So, you know, the pause I took at the beginning is because, you know, Asian women are making headlines right now for something that, you know, you mentioned, Cindu, you know, George Floyd's public lynching, like got people into gear. And I'm like, it took a murder. Okay. It took a murder to get people to be making all of these changes, institutional changes. And that's a really unacceptable bar, you know? And so there are these Asian women that were murdered and now things are making headlines, even though we talk about in the rhetoric about anti-Asian hate, people don't really know what that means. They can't put their hand on it, you know, unless it's like making front page news. And, you know, and then all of these intersections of what Asian identity is, right? People assumed, oh, well, they're sex workers or they're young or they're whatever. And they're not just Asian women. 2 of them were Chinese and 4 of them were Korean. You know, I'm like, state their names, you know, and like in, you know, how the movement of like, say her name, like say their names, say who they are, understand, like these were elder women in their communities, you know, some of them, you know, had all of these different lives back in their countries of origin, and people don't necessarily piece our identities with our migration stories, with our history, you know? And so a lot of times I'm like, people need to educate themselves. I cannot be like culturally taxed at all times to explain myself and then explain my personal professional location. I can do it for you, but I shouldn't have to do it for you. And it even shows up in like the academic literature, you know, or these data sets where I was having this conversation about an institutional data set at my particular institution. And somebody who was running these numbers said, oh, well, when we covary out Asian women, and I was like, whoa, wait, let's stop right there. Okay. Like, you know, this is quantitative data. This is thought to like have some level of objectivity. I was like, because you've done 2 things, like don't even finish the sentence. Like you've done 2 things right now. You've grouped like a whole bunch of people together, right? Without parsing out individual Asian and Pacific Islander identities. 2, you've also like really made some assumptions about kind of like the major minorities, right? That all Black and all Latinx and all Native American faculty are of the same personal and professional location, right? Like, so you've done like bad on all sides, you know, like, so when you're running these numbers, you have to be careful, right? We have to be careful about how our lens, our lack of understanding of history, our lack of understanding of migration, our lack of understanding of SES has factored in to that moment when you're just running some differential statistics, you know? So, you know, we get to the end result by leaving a bunch of context out, and that like really negatively impacts researchers, right? It does a disservice to them because some of them really want to learn, and they've taken these misunderstandings and they've integrated that into them, and they have othered us. And we are different, right? Diversity is not about putting everything in a pot, you know, or, you know, thank you for Melia for mentioning Jedi work. Well, Jedi work also doesn't have anti-racism like baked into that, you know, like those things are not synonymous with each other. So I think that, you know, one of my real big take home messages is that we have to be really careful, not like cautious, but care filled. Like be really full of care, you know, when we're looking at these things without making some of these general assumptions. And I take that from, you know, seeing that people don't see me in this embodied space, you know, that even though my research somebody wouldn't pick me out of my portfolio and be like, oh, she's the one that studies diversity. She's the one that studies equity. But my embodied experience is meaningful. Like who I am within the systems, those locations, those are defining. And so I wish we had more sharing about this. You know, I think that Asian and Pacific Islander stories aren't told. And some of that is because some of that is cultural, some of that is insular. You know, stories were told within my family. Some of those stories wouldn't make sense to other people. I come from a place of, like, my family comes from a place of great mysticism and paradox and things that aren't linear. So, you know, I love to engage, particularly in community, with using storytelling as a way of healing, as a way of sharing narrative and seeing these intersections and these bridges, because I think that's how stereotypes are dismantled. Like you have to just hear from the individual. In psychology and in sociology, we call it contact hypothesis. You know, let somebody experience you. You know, if you share, then people will know, and they'll know the diversity of your stories.
Thank you so much for that very care-filled and thoughtful answer, right? I mean, because I think a lot of times those larger categories, which are there for institutional framework purposes, don't always serve the lived experiences, and definitely gloss over the many different components and aspects that create our identities, especially as women of color. You start with these big categories: women of color, people of color, and then it's like within that, then it's the sort of stock, like the ones that you mentioned: Latinx, Black, Indigenous, and then within those, there's whole histories and places and experiences and generational encounters and values and beliefs. And even for myself as an African-American woman, as a Black woman, I'm also I'm a Black biracial woman. So a lot of times, there are assumptions about Blackness or where I might be from. And so, yes, I grew up in an urban area, but I grew up in an urban area with a white working class family, and my dad's family, African-American families from the South. And it's two very different worlds colliding. It makes for a very specific experience in the 1980s in New Jersey. And those are things that I'm hard pressed to find other Black academics who share those experiences, to be quite honest, within my age group. And so I think, we have to have these conversations that are more nuanced and more layered. And when there's time, when there's opportunity, right? And so that's another kind of piece of the puzzle. So thanks so much, though, Liza, for taking the time to share that about yourself with us and kind of connect that to the larger framework. Melia, we'd like to hear from you about the equity and justice work. So equity and justice work is a field that is largely dominated by people of color. And as a white woman, what do you see as your role in this work? Recently, there's been some backlash against, white folks doing the work, or white allies, pushback. And so what do you make of that? And sort of how do you see your role and your space in this?
Yeah. So I was, thinking on this question, and it took me back to, gosh, a while ago, I had an opportunity to do a ride along with fire department. And there was a time where they were responding to a call that was an individual who was having a psychotic break. And they got there, they were able to get this individual to a place of a little more stability. And then they took them to the hospital. And then as we were driving away, I was like, what happens next? Like, how do you know if this person is okay? How do you know, or what do you know? And they said, that's not our role. We did what we do. And then we took this individual to the place where the folks can take them on to the next space. And that was hard for me at the time, but when I think about it now and applying it to this work, as a white woman in the work, I really think that my work is to help white folks and prepare white folks to be able to adequately and appropriately hear my colleagues of color, knowing that the fragility and the kind of earth shaking underneath us of like, wait a second, everything that I've been taught is inaccurate, it's lies, and it's wrong. And how do I reckon with this and hold this space? So I hope that in my work, what I can do is lay some foundations and put some of the very core, basic, common language, get folks, being able to engage in authentic dialogue. They're hard conversations, but the more we have them and the more we practice them, they get less hard. We know they don't get easy, but I think the ability and the skill sets can grow. So I hope, in my space, I can see that foundational work. There are things that I can't do, and there are things that I absolutely should not be doing as a white practitioner in this work. But if I can, get folks to do some of the self-work and the awareness and start understanding some history in ways that they will actually hear and listen and follow women, Black women, Indigenous women, Asian Pacific Islanders, and hear them and believe them even if they can't understand. Because how can I, in my body and my lived experiences, I have empathy and there are things I can relate to, but I cannot truly understand the experiences of others. So I want to be able to help folks get to a place where we just believe you. And if we believe you, then we can all get in this work together and tip those scales. And in terms of the backlash, there is a history, right? There's plenty of history for folks to be suspect of white folks. There's no denying that. And I think, white supremacy and capitalism, right? And the elements of how they run together run so deep. And so I, looking at this work and having white privilege, I could see at times when there might be clients who see me as a safer option, right? Maybe I won't push so hard, or maybe it won't, maybe this will ease into this work. And I think that's a space to do damage, right? And that's where I really had to come to terms with, I'm not here for my clients to like me. I'm here to be useful to the cause. And so, but I think it's very easy to not see what we don't see. I think it's very easy to slide back into whiteness without seeing it. So without accountability partners, right? Without deep and trusting relationships with other practitioners in the work, I think there can be a lot of damage that is done. And I've seen, I've seen organizations, right, that do kind of organizational development and leadership programs, and all of a sudden they have some implicit bias courses, and all of a sudden they have some of these other DI courses, and it's right, it's the buzz of the year, and it's important work and it's relevant work, but what it takes, I think, to hold the work with integrity takes constant self-interrogation and constant work of towing the line, right? Of how can I be this and be useful where I can, and know that I'm not useful everywhere, even though, right, the world would have told me and convinced me that I am, right? I'm a leader, I'm exceptional. That's what everyone's been telling me my whole life, when really what's been exceptional are the opportunities and the access that I've had because of multiple aspects of societal privilege that I hold. And so to say let me interrogate that, because it might, I should be entering the space as a learner. As if I can enter a space as a learner and a partner and a collaborator, and not a leader with all the answers, right? White savior coming into this space. So I think there's a lot of unlearning to do. A lot of white folks with really great intentions, right? Who want to see the change, but haven't always done our own self-work that is, again, something that we will do for the rest of our lives. So I hope to hold the work with integrity and honor for my brothers and sisters and siblings. We'll say siblings, siblings of color.
Thanks so much, Melia. I appreciate your candidness around the self-work and the sort of ongoing nature of that. That's so necessary to doing, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the spaces that we occupy. And I think that, definitely accounting for, whiteness and the sort of privileges that come with that is really another critical component. So thank you for discussing that. So I think in the interest of making sure that we have some time for Q&A, and this is where I remind folks who are attending to use the Q&A, please. Definitely panelists are happy to answer some of your questions as you've been listening, things that may have come up for you. We will move into the last question, the more general open question for folks. And so this one will be directed toward all of our panelists, and each person will have a few minutes to answer. So I really appreciate everyone's time and for coming together to be part of this, to listen to one another and to, find some common ground and points of connection. And it's really appreciated, especially at a time where I don't know about you all, but I get asked to do a lot of things during Black History Month and Women's History Month. And so these are the two busiest months of the year for me, February, March, and doing everything now on Zoom virtually. It's, I do appreciate that you've chosen to spend 90 minutes with us, with Visceral Change, and with the audience today in front of your computer again, as I'm sure we're all doing a lot of this right now. So first of all, thank you for that. The self-care is real. Burnout in this work, and especially even just regularly without the pandemic, right, is real. And so adding to that is, I just want to acknowledge that. And so my last question is sort of I guess a little along the lines of like the typical Women's History Month is, I like to think intergenerationally. And so I think about my younger self, and it's something that, has come up in our conversation today is like, Cindu, you can remember when you were a little girl and you experienced racism, and, Liza, you spoke of, the stories and the identity formation and development for yourself, as a woman, in terms of culture. And Melia, you mentioned linking about your younger self and your career choice and how that propelled you in a different direction. And Smadar, you shared with us these memories of your mom and being little and knowing that you really wanted to do work on space from the time you were young. And so the final question kind of connects back to all of that. And, what would you tell, or what would you give your younger self in girlhood or somewhere along your journey in school or your educational journey? What kind of advice, given what you know about life and society and the world now, what advice would you give your younger self, or what would you tell your younger self? Or maybe there's an object, something meaningful or symbolic or inspiring that you would pass along with the story to your younger self. Whoever wants to go first.
I guess I'll go if no one's volunteering. I think I would tell myself a few things, and just that I've learned along the way. One of them is different isn't deficient, right? I spent so many years of my life being ashamed of being Indian because I was, socialized to feel that shame. And there's so much value in being different, right? And so I always try to teach my students that. So different isn't deficient, it's just different, and we need different, right? Otherwise, the world is so boring. Another thing is that there's always going to be haters, right? And usually those haters are insecure with themselves. And so like the, grief I've got just from, and I would say trauma that I have of working in my own college, the one that I'm in now and the ones that I was before, typically come from white women. And, at the end of the day, I realize now that they were envious, or they were insecure, or they were jealous. I didn't know that then, but it's so clear now, right? And so to realize that, and I think I always tell myself, and I wrote this in the chat to somebody who asked a question to me, is that you're not there to be liked. You're here to do your job, right? So as long as you're doing your job, it's okay if people don't like you, right? Because you're not going to always have people to like you. And then I would say the last thing that I would tell myself when I started this work is that, don't buy into elitism. And I know there's higher ed, so much elitism just in general. And I think, I am very proud to teach at a community college. I don't have my PhD, I have my master's. And I think 10 years ago, I would try to hide that, right? I'd be at conferences. I do a lot of presentations. I I'm very proud for what I'm doing in the work that I do. But I think people just kind of assume that I have my doctorate. They assume I'm a first generation college student, and I am not, they don't assume that. They don't believe that, right? And so I think that there's a lot of elitism, and I think we need to really disrupt that. And the point of education is to be accessible, right? And so it doesn't matter where you got your PhD from, or if you have your PhD, right? It matters that you're being a good educator and that you're creating change. And so those are the three things that I would tell myself.
I can go next. I think I would tell myself, I would try to make myself forgive myself and be nicer to myself, which is something that I wasn't. Even at early, well, not early, but even as a more of a child than what I am now. So many years ago, I'm thinking of several incidents in my life, specifically, for example, at the end of middle school, we had to take this aptitude test, and you're not supposed to fail in this aptitude tests, right? But I certainly failed in this aptitude test. And almost in every single category, I was way below the mean. And then they gave this prediction that I will not be able to finish high school, and had 30% chance to finish trade school, and that career for life, maybe. They said, oh, you maybe can be a hairdresser, but even that may not be, because your fine motor skills are very low. So maybe you can be the shampoo girl. And that was created a lot of problems for me to go to high school. So in that moment in time, apart from being devastated because I knew I wanted to go to the university, and in that test they killed my options, I also knew that I have a hard time to go to high school, and I didn't get accepted to high schools in my city in Jerusalem, and I had to I felt like I'm jumping off a cliff. I went to high school. I struck a deal with the interviewer to get me in, and and I'll take summer school, and it induced so much. And if I fail in some high grade that he wanted me to succeed in, I'll be kicked out of the school. It induced so much anxiety, and I would want to tell myself, it will be fine, it will be okay. Just the knowledge that there's there's something, because I didn't get the support from my parents, and I was all alone in this journey, and it was really, really hard, because they said, okay, fine, so you'll not go to the university, you'll not go to a good high school, a high school, it's okay. And I really wanted to study, and this is something that I would tell myself to that it will be okay. So, and forgive myself if there are some parts that are not the best part in the journey, that it's okay to and it's okay. And the thing is that I say it a lot to my students, it's okay, it's important actually to fail and learn from whatever failure happened, and learn from these mistakes and continue forward. And while I did that, every failure for me was devastating, because I was afraid that, and this is the imposter syndrome, that here it is, someone will know that I'm not supposed to be here. In fact, my very first time teaching physics in UCLA, I was afraid that, I had this imagination that someone would come and say, you're not supposed to be teaching physics. And this is, so I would, maybe in many incidents in my life, I would tell myself that it will be okay. So, and just give myself some hope, because I felt constantly that there's no hope, but I'll try, because otherwise I'm bust. So I have to do this. And that created a lot of anxiety. So I would try to minimize this anxiety, but giving some hope. And the usual thing, don't let people put you under a label, which I think is really important.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Smadar. Really appreciate it.
A little of that across the Zoom nonverbal you, me. Thanks. I would tell a younger me, you get to and you will change your mind and change your direction. I mean, you can do it as many times as you want, as many times as it takes to find your magic. I will quote one of my fellow Peace Corps volunteers from many years ago had said, he was cursed with diverse interests. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, yeah, that's it. Because I was not at all like Smadar. I did not know what I wanted to be. I was like, well, maybe it's this, or maybe it's that, or maybe it's... So I entered college undecided. I stayed undecided till like the day that I couldn't anymore. And I had a academic advisor who was kind of like, well, let's take a test and see where you'll fit and see where you'll land. And it landed me in speech communications, which I truly loved, and it was really exciting. And it also was like, it still doesn't tell me where to go exactly. I still have to figure it out. And in my early 20s, my mom keeps a happiness file. I don't know if your moms have like the things that you had once shared with them, or some of them that keep it. So she had printed out an email that I had sent in my early 20s. And I was talking about how I still really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, but I had just seen a quote that was inspiring me. And it was, the greatest use of life is to spend it for something that will outlast it. And my mom pulled that out maybe a year or so ago, pulled it out of her happiness file and sent it back to me and said, it looks like you found it. And it took me, ebbs and turns and flows and some career tries that were like, this cannot be how I spend my life. But it always felt so final, like, oh, you have to make a decision, you have to choose a major, you have to choose a career, and it felt so forever. And it's not, and it doesn't have to be, and you can change your mind.
Thank you for that so much, Melia. I mean, and I would say, interestingly, my own daughter is entering college, and she's very undecided with many interests. And, I keep trying to tell her that it's okay. Like, you're going to figure it out. It could change. You might change schools even, right? I'm a big proponent. A lot of people think about making a choice of university, and that's where they're going to go, and that's where they're going to be. And I'm just like, you might not like that university, and it's okay if you transferred, right? Or if you decide you really want to do something that's just not offered there, right? And you have to go somewhere else. Like, these are some of the things that I think, too, like, gender plays a role sometimes in how we experience that or think about it or internalize it, right? And so thanks for sharing that. And as a person also with too many interests who drove my college advisor crazy of like, why are you taking this? Why are you taking that? No, like, you need to. And I just say, I was a perpetual double major my entire life, even through the PhD. So, having all those interests, sometimes things will fall away. Sometimes you'll do one thing at one time and transition and do something else. And sometimes you hold several things up because you like them all, right? And so just letting folks know, like, giving permission to like younger women and girls to like, be in it and be present and like explore all the things, right? And it's okay if something doesn't work out or if you change your mind. So thanks so much for that, Melia and Liza.
So I think that's so endearing, Melia, that your mom has a happiness file, because my mom has the opposite. I was like, my parents were like, remember when you did this? Like, they have aggregated every sin, mainly to use if my daughters act up. They're like, remember? I'm like, I don't see how I could forget now, but that actually is what I would tell my younger self. And when I thought about this question, actually, all of you said to my younger self what my younger self needed to hear, right? So like, that was all had so much symmetry for me. And so the only thing that I really have to add is I would tell my younger self, you're enough, like, you're good. I was sitting here listening to you all share, and the sun is setting in my window. Like, I didn't enjoy those things. There was all of these extraneous pressures. And I remember thinking, I've had these, I'm a clinician by training and all of that stuff, right? So, you go through your own self-reflective process. And then, you know, you join the academy and you're like, what am I doing here? So you're trying to do like reflexive praxis and like, you know, do your deep dive all the time. And, you know, I was like, man, you know, I wasn't told that enough. I don't, you know, that like I was worthy. I'm like, I'm good enough, because we're constantly in an evaluative framework. And I think especially as young women of color, young girls of color, young girls, period. You know, I was told, you know, you're going to have to jump way over that bar. You're going to have to work twice as hard. And there was a lot of fear-driven narratives. And I've passed those on. I have 2 college-age daughters now, you know, because remember, I was a young mom. Like, back to the opening story about like, you know, early in, early out, you know, that I've done that. I didn't have the insight when they were young, because I was young, you know, and to not instill that fear in them. And so, you know, I've tried to pull back over time to be like, it's okay. Like my oldest, she's graduating college, and I'm like, it's okay. You're 21. Like, what do you know? You know, like, what do you think you know? It's okay not to know. Like, come back home. Do whatever you need to do, because I want you to feel whole. I want you to have permission to take your time. I got you, you know? So it's like changing those narratives feels really good. And like, you know, so many of you said, I mean, I don't know what my younger self thought, but I know it's not who I am today, but I'm happy with who I am today. And I wish I could have been happier with who I am, who I was then. So I'd be like, girl, love on yourself. Like, you're good. Like, you're going to have awesome people in your life and all the things like that I try to tell my girls now when they get down. I'm like, it's cool. It's a bump. It's a bump in the road, you know? So yeah. And all of your messages. So thank you for saying those to my younger self too.
Thank you so much for that, Liza, and everyone, because I definitely, you know, so many of the answers, you know, resonate. And I think even about, you know, Cindu, you talk about like embracing, you know, your identity and your, you know, your background and your race and ethnicity earlier. And I definitely think that, you know, having grown up mostly raised by my white family, that it was definitely, you know, the narrative of me being sort of exceptional, right? Like growing up in New Jersey and being exposed to a lot of the kinds of news and things that were framed around the very, you know, negative frameworks and anti-Black frameworks. And my family, you know, my white family feeling they needed to reassure me that I was not, right, that person, or I wasn't part of that group of Black people. And I think that, you know, that was very damaging, even though I don't think they intended it to be, right? I think it was their way of protecting me or trying to, you know, assure me that that I was, you know, valued in a certain way. And so I think that, you know, education and these conversations are so important, and thinking about, you know, affirming our younger selves, and, you know, that grace to understand that, like, we didn't know what we know now. And maybe the people, you know, in our lives, some of the people who are closest to us in their good intentions, they also didn't have certain education or information that may have been helpful or positioned us differently. And so I think part of me is about, like, yes, thinking back and trying to be kinder to myself, but also thinking about too that some of the damaging messages that came to me, not excusing them, but like having a level of like understanding and grace for like how they came to be. But I think that all of these things are just so important in terms of our journeys. And I'm so glad that, you know, we were able to come together and folks were able to share. There is one question that came in the Q&A, and so I will put it out there, and whoever would like to answer it. And the person mentioned how both Melia and Cindu talked about haters in the work, and sometimes, you know, we're doing this work, it's not our job to be liked per se, right? When we're in these spaces of trying to push the conversation, the agenda of diversity, equity, inclusion. And the person asked, you know, mentioned how, you know, it becomes a shoot the messenger situation sometimes, like we're the ones who absorb folks' negative responses and pushback and things like that, in a way that men don't experience to the same degree. And so, you know, even if we change, the person asks, even if we can change ourselves, right, to be steeled against this, how do we begin to change our working environments, right? Because it's one thing to be able to like go into the space knowing what we know and be like, that's it. I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to say this, and no matter what, I'm not going to, internalize. But how do we begin to change the environments? So whoever wants to jump in.
I'll say something really quick just because I work with a lot of organizations. I think one, you have to work towards cultivating an inclusive, right, culture, and that has to be from the top down. So you have all the ideas, but if your leaders are not standing behind creating an inclusive and equitable and anti-racist culture, then your efforts aren't going to really go very far, right? You might create like a workshop or a council, but you really need to figure out how to infuse DEI or JEDI or EDI or whatever you call it into the infrastructure, into the DNA of your organization in order for the culture to change. That's my small little tidbit.
Can I follow up? I completely agree about the top-down idea. So I mean, as a student, as a postdoc, I really try to advance and change the culture. But as a faculty, I had so much force to do that and so much power. So I'm the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in our department. I founded it, and I remember I've been in UCLA. I think this is my 6th year. I must admit that the Corona time has really warped the sense of time for me. So I'm not so sure anymore. It could have been 20 years, but anyway. So I have at the beginning when I started it as an assistant professor before tenure even, I felt that it was, Smadar is doing something and the department has something else. But as time went by and we continued both to educate ourselves and to implement institutional changes, and there were fruits for everything that we've done, I have seen now that in the past 1.5 to 2 years, you cannot decouple the day-to-day discussion in our department from teaching, from handling students, from research with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It has become the part of the daily discussion. And and I'm not saying that in UCLA we're done. We're a reflection of our nation and of our world, and we're still flawed. But I think that the fact that it had become suddenly something that people care about and talk about, even when I'm not there, and even when none of the people who work with me in the committee are there, that it had become part of the conversation. This for me showed that there is some change, and I really think it had to come from above. It had to come. I had the support also of the chair, and so the fact that there is some support in the department, I think really helped to percolate this down. So I'm completely agreeing with you. I said it too long. I'm sorry.
Well, I would love to jump in and kind of like bridge it to that other question, because I was thinking about part of that question. And so, a challenge for girls is don't steal yourself. Don't make yourself steely, is that I think about the complicity in the systems in which we are trying to dismantle, and I was like, I can't show up like a man. I always make this distinction between parking lot Liza and office Liza, right? I'm like, Liza in the office, like her hair's all straight, like she's trying to like, I don't know, be smart or something. And then there's parking lot Liza, which is like, I don't want to say that's who I am, but that's a different woman out there. And and she comes with like a level of grit and like fire in her that isn't appropriate for the workplace. Quit trying to bring parking lot Liza inside. Like leave her out there. You don't want to know her, But it's like we have to parse ourselves apart, and like we're socialized to think that we have to be a certain way within the workplace, within these spheres. And so I think it's a challenge, to raise young people, across the gender identification spectrum, right? That understand that they can be who they are, because otherwise the world will never accept us. They don't know us. We are not teaching them and socializing them how to be with us, So I would tell, girls, it's like, find your people. There are good people out there. There will people who will mentor you and they will champion you. They are out there, I promise, So when you hit a lonely ditch, it's just one, like pivot, just pivot, and, inspire them with hope. because I think that's actually how the best way to deal with haters is like, you know, don't clam up and become something you're not, because that just has a detrimental, like, battle fatigue impact on your heart, your spirit, and your walk. You know, it's like you have a purpose, and so keep on doing that with who you are.
Thank you so much for that. And I put a few last questions in the chat about how do folks feel they're using their voice to move the needle on equality and opportunity for women. And then also about sort of, you know, one challenge you would make. And Liza, you kind of answered that, and I appreciate that. And I think that is so true, right? It's sort of like, instead of trying to make yourself into something else, right? Like just honoring who you are and finding those people that value you and appreciate you among your peers and in, you know, your family and your community, right? I think that's really the key, is like, we need those sources of acceptance and, you know, value and inspiration and support from all of those places. And I think that's been one of the real challenges for young people during this time of pandemic, is like how to find that and how to keep that, you know, going, or have that in their lives during this isolation and quarantine and other things that we've all experienced in the past year. But I think there is something key to that, like, wholeness, right? And that truth. And I think so often it's easy for young girls to believe that they don't know who they are. They're trying to figure it out, right? Or that they need to be somebody else's version of who they are, that as they change, as they get older, you know, like, oh, you know, they're still being associated with some of the things that they did when they were younger. And how do they, you know, break away from that, or assert these new things about them that have emerged? So yeah, there's so much going on there, but I really appreciate all of the answers. And as we're closing out here, as we come to time, if there's any sort of last words or, you know, final ideas or notions for the good of the cause, I'd love to just open it up quickly for any last words from the panelists. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
I will say something, and then I have to hop off to another meeting. I think one of I was reading the question, it's like, what is a challenge, or how do you use your voice? I think we have to have a collective voice, right? And not kind of pit each other and be against each other, but really come together across racial groups and just as women, right? And to use that voice to demand for equality. And I think so, just kind of being there, and, you know, there's the phrase empowered women empower women. And I think that's a challenge, right? Because you see that doesn't happen all the time, unfortunately. So, yeah.
What struck me, or kind of the question made me think of a different piece around the one challenge for our girls to take on. It reminded me that just recently I heard the change of instead of encouraging young people to think about what they want to be, like, what do you want to be? To encourage young people to say, like, identify a problem in the world that you want to work on, and then find a way to do that, right? Like, what is there? So if I think how would young girls make our world a better place? It's like living their truth and finding it. So knowing, like, here's the thing about the world that I don't like, and I'm going to go after it and work to eliminate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I think that's a great note to close us out on. Just one last thank you to everyone for being here today, and in the audience and on the panel. Keep up the good work. And I hope that this has been just a good and inspiring kind of communal moment for everyone. And I hope that folks can carry this good energy into their evening and for the rest of Women's History Month. Thanks so much.